I don't really think Disney and Pixar anticipated this or planned it this way, but Incredibles 2 really is a pretty fitting Father's Day movie. So, if you're looking for something to go see, just saying.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yaniz Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this episode, we're going to be talking about Incredibles 2, the brand new film from Disney and Pixar, as well as just sort of jumping into a broader discussion on Pixar Animation Studios, its filmography, its history, just kind of general sweeping thoughts on my perspective on Pixar, what it means to me, and that kind of thing. So, first things first, you can read my Incredibles 2 review on monkeysfightingrobots.com. I will put the link to that in the show notes below. Overall, I know it's according to the box office results, it looks like it's aiming for about $180 million this weekend, which is by far a record for an animated film. And it makes sense. It's been 14 years since the original Incredibles film. You have writer-director Brad Bird back leading this entry in the franchise, and I think it's the box office results really show not only how much people love the first one, but how much people have been waiting for a sequel. I mean, we've gotten a third Toy Story, 3 Cars movies, a Monsters University, a Monsters Inc. prequel, essentially, Finding Nemo sequel / spinoff, and in between in the gap between the first 2 Incredibles movies. And this has always struck me as the Pixar franchise that most lent itself to a series of films as opposed to a one-off, just by the sheer nature of the fact that it's a superhero story and there's always other villains to face, and the family dynamic, which was very much at the heart of of the first film, as well as this one, evolves over time, and the roles of parent and child change just like people change in real life and develop over the different stages of especially childhood, adolescence, and that kind of thing. So it makes sense that Pixar is finally pursuing a sequel to that. I think the big holdout, as far as I know, was Bird himself. I believe he was sort of reticent to make a sequel because he doesn't really see himself as a sequel guy. He didn't want to get stuck into that trap. Of course, then we've had the whole debacle with Tomorrowland, which, if you're not listening to Blank Check podcast, they've been doing a Brad Bird filmography on all his films. I believe this week they're supposed to post the Tomorrowland review, but that was very much Brad Bird's Blank Check film, which the one that really crashed and burned for him creatively. Not that the film was terrible, but it did sort of feel a little bit uneven, and like it had a great concept that wasn't fully realized, or at least executed to the full extent of its potential. But Disney lost a lot of money on that film, and I think that really set him back and made him realize, well, you know what? Maybe the Incredibles sequel is looking pretty good right now. I don't know if they were really working on it before then. They may have been. Maybe it was maybe they let him do Tomorrowland in order for him to commit to Incredibles 2. It's unclear, but before the first Incredibles, he'd only done The Iron Giant, and then after Incredibles, he did Ratatouille, Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, and then Tomorrowland, and now he's returning to this franchise. So the bottom line is, you want to know my thoughts. Is Incredibles 2 any good? Yeah, it's great. It's a lot of fun. I think you can see a lot of Brad Bird trying to come up with a sequel idea that wasn't natural. It didn't come about organically. That this feels like the kind of movie that wasn't already, it wasn't the kind of thing that he had written the first one and he had notes for what would happen in the sequel. This feels very much like, okay, I told that story. Now, shit, what happens next? I guess I have to come up with a sequel because the studio wants one. It does feel very much that. It's not necessarily a cash grab per se. I mean, all films are to a certain extent, but it doesn't feel like something that he was super necessarily passionate about from the get-go. I'm sure once he wrote the story, once he had ideas, once they were in production, I'm sure he got more invested in the project, and he's very committed to everything that he does. It shows in his filmography, which is pretty solid, even though Tomorrowland is a little bit of a weak spot for me personally, and I guess for the industry at large. But it doesn't feel like something that he was necessarily um, necessarily really passionate about from the jump. It's not something that he really felt like, oh, I need to tell this story or anything like that. But it has a lot of great character moments. The gist of the story is basically an inverse of the first film, whereas Incredibles 1 focused on Mr. Incredible and his sort of secret mission, keeping that from his wife, and his sort of using that as a metaphor for like a midlife crisis and for marital problems, and you know, the fact that the family sort of had fallen apart, so to speak, or drifted apart. In this one, it's Elastigirl that actually takes point on the superhero mission part of it. So she's out there trying to basically rehabilitate the image of supers in this world where they're still outlawed. And Mr. Incredible is the one at home with the kids dealing with Jack's evolving powers, dealing with a kind of convoluted subplot with Violet and the boy that she likes. And Dash is having math problems, I guess. That's pretty much the only real subplot that Dash gets this time around, which is far less effective than I think his wanting to compete in sports and be more involved and show off his powers in the first film. Basically, Incredibles 2 feels beat for beat very similar to Incredibles 1 in a lot of ways. There's that he does like clever twists on certain elements of the first film, but like as I said, inverting the focus, and I think it basically does reveal that Elastigirl is probably the most dynamic character of the Parr family. She's the most interesting. She's the most fun to watch in battle. She's she's one of the most complex characters of the bunch, I'd say. But you get a lot of callbacks to the original film, not like hardcore fan service, but there's Edna Mode shows up again to help them in a moment of crisis, to help the Parr member of the Parr family that's left with the children, left running the family, as opposed to the one that's out running missions. You get another call. You get more Frozone, which is nice because I think Samuel L. Jackson probably wanted a bigger role, and I know that character in his "Honey, where's my super suit?" was a really standout moment from the first film. So you get a little bit of a callback to that, and it's fun. It's got a lot of things going for it. But my problem with it is, and this is my sort of dilemma with this film, is I did give it a positive review on Monkeys Fighting Robots, but it's one of those films that you walk out and you're like, that was a great experience. I really enjoyed this scene and I really enjoyed this scene, but there's nothing in it. If you break it down, the different elements of the story, and you put it up against the first one, it basically falls short on pretty much every level. I think the first one is more imaginative. I think the first one feels fresher. I mean, by sheer nature that it's not a sequel. I think some of the action beats are more memorable. I think this one looks better because the animation has improved over the last 14 years, and it's gotten a lot richer. But there's nothing in here that felt to me like an improvement upon the original. It felt like a continuation, but like basically falls into the sequelitis issue where more and bigger. So there's simultaneously not enough going on, but too much going on at the same time. And I think part of that just chalked up to the fact that a lot of the subplots aren't particularly effective. As I mentioned, Dash's story here is basically a non-issue. Violet's sort of feels just kind of like a rehash of her story from the first one, and it doesn't really even get properly resolved with certain elements of it. Mr. Incredible's thing is great, but he's just kind of waiting around, struggling with that. That's probably the most relatable part of the film. I'm a father of a small child, and so the things with him and Jack and being tired and trying to figure out how to being stressed out and trying to figure all that out, navigate the world of parenthood from a more hands-on perspective. I thought that all really worked and was fun to watch, but at the same time didn't really expand upon the world of Incredibles too much. The film I mean, I'm glad we have it, but it's not necessarily something that it's not a next level sequel. Or as I feel like Toy Story 2 in a way improves upon the first one and deepens the characters a lot more. There was nothing here that was quite at that same level. I'd probably say, as far as the Pixar sequels go, I'd probably say this is above the Cars, because everything's above the Cars movies for me pretty much with Pixar. uh, and slightly above Finding Dory, but low below Toy Story 2 and Toy Story 3. I feel like those films are far superior as far as developing the characters, developing the universe in which they live, and I absolutely want to see an Incredibles 3, and I hope that they don't wait another 14 years to get on that, because these characters have so much life in them, and there's so many more stories to tell in this world with the pars and the whole ban on supers and all of the various elements in this film that could be picked up on. But I hope that they take more time and take more care in developing the next one, because like I said, this was a bit of a step down from The Incredibles, which is essentially a perfect movie. So it was kind of what was always going to be, even though it's super solid on its own right. So on Monkeys Fighting Robots, it breaks down a little more uneven. But if I have to pick a solid, half-star delineation, I would probably say this is a 4-star film, maybe slightly higher. I was between 4 and 4.5 stars for a while. But when you're talking about the sequel to The Incredibles, which is easily a 5-star film for me, it still feels like a little bit of a letdown. Even though if it was any other movie, if it wasn't a sequel to essentially, in my opinion, the best Pixar movie ever made, it would feel like one of the best animated films of the year. It probably still is one of the best animated films of the year, but it doesn't feel like the achievement that it would have otherwise, if that makes sense. So that's just my brief thoughts on Incredibles 2. Definitely see it. Take your kids. It's a ton of fun, and it's a lot of it's everything you would want it to be, but it's just not, to me, more than you would want it to be. It meets your expectations, but does it without really blowing you away, I guess. It's actually a perfect segue into a broader discussion on Pixar. So what I wanted to talk about here is Pixar has, since they came out with their first feature in 1995, that being, of course, Toy Story, has really established itself as a brand in the same way that Disney has. When you see a Disney movie, you know what you're expecting. You know you're going to get music, you're going to get usually a princess or some kind of fairy tale. You're going to get a film with a lot of heart and humor and something that will appeal presumably to all ages. And I think Pixar not only has sort of not copied that tone, but definitely it feels influenced by the Disney films that preceded it, that preceded the creation of the studio in general. I mean, before Toy Story, they were doing a lot of short films and things like that, but that film was such a landmark of cinema, especially for animation, but got a Special Achievement Oscar and immediately established Pixar as its own its own studio, but I was going to say its own creative brain trust. They basically essentially have a select number of people in a room that they'd help develop, break stories, and then from there, people are advanced up to directors or sole screenwriters, that kind of thing. But a lot of their things, it's very collaborative environments within Pixar. I remember years ago, I was at a screenwriting expo because I, dabble in that a little bit as well. I think most people interested in this industry do at some point. And I do think that they did have a session about the unique collaborative atmosphere and the environment that Pixar has cultivated since the very beginning. And that's been apparent in their films. For me, Incredibles 2 is their 20th film. For me, a Pixar film has always meant not only taking those core elements of a Disney film. I mean, granted, most of the Pixar movies are not musicals. They have musical numbers or like key, songs, musical sequences. I'm thinking of When She Loved Me from Toy Story 2, or I guess the best example, the only real musical one that they have is Coco. A lot of the other ones have music plays a key role, especially with the score, which is usually by Randy Newman or Thomas Newman or Michael Giacchino. But they don't they nail the humor and the heart and the imagination that Disney has brought to things back in the day. And more recently with the second Disney Renaissance with films like Big Hero 6 and Zootopia and Moana. But to me, there's something very specific about what a Pixar film is. It always feels more mature, typically more mature than a Disney film. And I don't mean mature as in racy. I mean mature as in the themes are richer, and they almost feel like animated films that are inspired by the Disney mold, that are made really more for adults to connect to emotionally resonate with. I mean, you talk about Up and that whole story and that whole, unforgettable sequence with the love story there and how the tragic turn that happens in that film, or some of the elements in films like The Incredibles, as I was mentioning, with it's basically a metaphor for midlife crisis and like having marital issues, or films like Inside Out, which is about the equal importance of joy and sadness in your life and how they kind of inform one another, and how it's okay to feel sadness, that you shouldn't be perpetuating. And that one specifically holds up to me as a film that feels like it's really aimed more towards adults than kids. Um, that joy and sadness both are important, and you need them in not to teach your kids necessarily to bury their sadness, but to express it and to work through it, to face it, to use that sadness to highlight the positive things in their life. Or something like Coco, which is about legacy and remembering the people in your life that you've lost and keeping their memory alive and following your dreams and being true to yourself and balancing your creative aspirations with your obligation to the people in your life. And Pixar, to me, has always manages to hit a level of sophistication with their stories and see the world in ways that we've never teach us to see the world in ways that we've never seen it. There's always, and this is a common thread through a lot of their, especially the first half of their filmography. It's like the world of toys that you never knew existed, the world of bugs that you never knew existed, the world of monsters in your closet, and how you open the closet door and you're in a whole other universe of Monstropolis and this whole monster-centric city. Or this is what fish are up to, or cars, or little rats that want to be chefs. I don't know. Um, they do. I mean, I quote this way too often, but um, if films are empathy machines, as Roger Ebert famously said, and I'm reading a Roger Ebert book now, so that's probably why that quote is even more, more top of mind for me than usual. The Pixar kind of they take it upon themselves to humanize everything. They humanize stories with touching to all forms of life, and even things that aren't sentient, like cars, or things that don't exist, like monsters, or things that are intangible, like emotions. They find a way of cutting into a concept like that and boiling it down so that it resonates emotionally with adults who see themselves in it and see the struggle in it, and it touches the inner child in them, as well as rings true with their experience as an adult, but also has enough, humor and enough colors and enough music, or fun characters to still attract kids, so that kids aren't bored. Kids are just as invested as adults, but you're basically putting messages in there that make the adults appreciate their life, or see it better, or see things in a better context, or a more enlightened perspective. But you're also teaching these important messages to kids so that they can understand. Toy Story 3, for God's sake, is all about mortality, basically. That whole movie's about, when you're reaching the end of your life, what do you do? How do you manage? How does that affect you? That's essentially what that movie's about. And I think, Pixar has so geniusly managed to play with these adult themes in the context of a children's film, essentially, or a series of children's films, as it may be. So that's, to me, what Pixar really means, what makes that studio so unique and its films so impactful. It's why every time I see a Pixar movie on the schedule, I'm immediately intrigued, even when a lot of times their teasers and their trailers are not really that great, because they don't really want to show anything. Traditionally, at least early on, their teasers were not even footage from the films themselves. They were just sort of a minute and a half long sketch inspired by the actual film, just trying to get you in the mindset of what tone and kind of the idea of what they're going for. So for me, Pixar is always, anytime Pixar comes out with anything, I'm there. As of now, to be honest though, as of now, the only Pixar film I haven't seen is Cars 3, because that's my one like blank spot with with the Pixar films, that I did not really enjoy the first Cars. I thought it was fine, but I thought it was the first film that they came out with where I was underwhelmed and like, this was kind of boring. So I the Cars sequels, I'm less well versed on than I should be as as a Pixar fanatic, which I guess I sort of qualify as. But other than that, I've seen all these films. I own almost all these films on either DVD or Blu-ray. Um, and I've seen most of them multiple times, and about 2/3 of their filmography is bananas good. Like basically either a near masterpiece or a masterpiece. Like they're all, about at least half of them are 4.5 and 5-star films, which is insane for any other studio or brand. That if I went through like the last 20 Disney films, there's no way they would have that. And by Disney, I mean Walt Disney Animation Studios, obviously. So like Moana, Zootopia, those, and there's no way they would have that level of success. Just speaking me personally, my top five, some of my favorite Pixar films are the Toy Story films, probably the first and third one, slightly more than the second one. Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Wall-E, and just below that probably Inside Out. Those are the ones that to me, and then Coco, I guess. I'm not really ranking them all. You can see my Letterboxd account on letterboxd.com to see my full ranking, and I have to put Incredibles 2 in there. I haven't done that just yet. But those are some of the films that to me inhabit or exhibit the qualities that I just said that make Pixar so great, and make their films so eminently rewatchable. That being said, even though Pixar has an amazing track record, there's still been some missteps in their history, and I should probably get into those a little bit now. So the first one, as I mentioned, was Cars. That film felt very prosaic to me. It had the imagination on the surface from a conceptual standpoint of, oh, what if cars were alive? But the story felt very cookie cutter for Pixar, and to me, it felt like basically the first hint of weakness. The first that, okay, this studio is capable of producing not a flop, but kind of a substandard film that didn't exactly light the world on fire. And even though the film was a hit and it sold tons of merchandise, which is why they made the sequels, for me, it's never been something I've ever felt really like I wanted to revisit. Um, Coming after Toy Story, A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters Inc., Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles, Cars was my first disappointment with Pixar. Then you follow that with Ratatouille, which is a really strong film, and I know a lot of people actually, I feel like it's aged really well. A lot of people seem to think that that's one of their best ones, which I don't know if I can quite go that far, but it is a really good film, and it was Brad Bird's second Pixar film. But then you had Wall-E, which to me is one of the best. Up, which is slightly overrated. I mean, it's great, but it got a Best Picture nomination, and I don't really think it's one of the best Pixar films, despite that opening sequence and the amazing Michael Giacchino score. Toy Story 3, which is an excellent film. Cars 2, which is not an excellent film. And then after Toy Story 3, really, to me, they had a few missteps in a row. And that would be Cars 2, which to me is by far, and I think most people agree with this, the weakest film that they've come out with to date. That feels like a cash grab in the way that Incredibles 2 doesn't. And it basically feels like a straight-to-DVD Pixar film. It feels like the straight-to-DVD Pixar film that Toy Story 2 almost ended up being. That feels like what Cars 2 is to me. And it's not only have I not felt the urge to revisit it, I actually rented it one time and did not see it in theaters because, as I mentioned, not a fan of Cars. And I think I actually turned it off halfway through because I was like, this is really terrible. And it depressed me to watch a Pixar movie that was that bad. So that's their biggest shit movie that I've seen. With the close second being another film I'm talking about in a minute. Oh, not the very next one, but a little bit. Brave came out after Cars 2. And Brave is not necessarily a bad film. I think it's good. I think it got a lot of crap. I don't know why exactly it got so much crap. Probably because it's a princess. And to me, it feels like it feels not quite prosaic in the way that the Cars storyline is, because there are a lot of interesting twists and turns in Brave. And I think the marketing did it a really good favor by not revealing exactly what the story is of that film is exactly, with Merida and her mom and that whole how that all plays out. But it doesn't feel inherently Pixar, and I think that's my biggest issue with it. It feels like a movie that Walt Disney Animation Studios could have easily made. It didn't. It doesn't have the quite the imagination or ingenuity to it that a lot of the other Pixar films have. Um, and it's interesting here because, like I said, after Toy Story 3, you have Cars 2, which is not that great, Brave, which is fine, but after Toy Story 3, you have like four, like it becomes very much hit or miss actually. Basically after that, every other Pixar film is really great, and I'm hoping that Incredibles 2 can change that pattern. So you had Toy Story 3, Cars 2, Brave, and then Monsters University, which is again after Brave, which is not great but decent. Monsters University feels like another misstep. I don't know who on earth wanted a prequel to Monsters Inc., but apparently Disney and Pixar decided that's what they wanted to do, and so Mike and Sully are in college, which again feels like a straight to DVD idea. It feels like they had a goofy movie and then they did an extremely goofy movie. This feels like that almost. It's not a terrible film. It's fine. It's just not great. It's just like I think I gave that 2.5 stars, which it puts it not quite at the bottom of the Pixar list for me, but like basically bottom five of the 20. This is in the bottom five, along with the Cars 2, Cars. I haven't seen Cars 3, like I mentioned, and another film we're gonna get to in a minute here. So Monsters University just felt like an idea that nobody really asked for. It's sort of the Solo thing, the thing I said on Solo, where it's like, why does this? Why? I mean, I guess you wanted to make this, and it's okay, I guess, but nobody really asked for this, and it's not. You're not convincing anybody, justifying its existence by the way that you're executing the idea. So that's my things with Monsters University. Inside Out is fucking outstanding, and if not top tier, then like right outside it. And that's a film I need to rewatch again. Now that I have a daughter, I'm worried that if I watch that, I'm gonna be an even uh, bigger puddle of tears than I was when I saw it in theaters and again on Blu-ray. But that is an outstanding film, and I really love most of what Pete Docter does. That's the director on that movie. He also did Up, and what else did he do? He did another one, Monsters Inc. So his films are right up there with Brad Bird's for me, or like on a similar playing field at least. Then after Inside Out, remember Monsters University, Inside Out, great. Good Dinosaur, stubble, that's like the most movie that I think they've come out with outside the Cars films, which, as I said, I'm pretty much on the side of they're not for me at this point. But The Good Dinosaur is the only film that's not a Cars film that I will straight up say is a bad movie. I did not enjoy that in the slightest. It felt like the tonally was all over the place. There was nothing in it that felt particularly fresh or interesting or imaginative or up to the standard that Pixar has set for itself with most of its previous films. Then we had Finding Dory, which I like a lot. I don't think it's perfect. I think it's by far substandard, but still better than, or still not up to the level of Incredibles 2. Like I said, those two are I feel like in a similar category for me in that they came out way later. They're sequels that came out over a decade after the original film that attempt to do something new with those characters, but not really. I feel like Finding Dory at least has a fresher angle than Incredibles 2, which basically just does the opposite of what the first one did. But I feel like Incredibles 2 is actually executed much better and is more fun to watch, has better action, it's funnier moments. I think the characters in there have more potential for future storylines. Incredibles kind of lends itself to a sequel. Finding Nemo, not so much. So I think that the fact that it's clearly a Monsters University level, we don't really need this, but we're going to give it to you anyway. I think that they actually pulled it off pretty well considering. Cars 3 I haven't seen. Coco I love. And then that brings us right up to Incredibles 2. So then they have a really strong track record. And it's interesting. I think that they rely, and this is probably the Disney higher-ups, influence. I think they have way too much of a focus on sequels and prequels. Other than Toy Story and Incredibles, I really have no interest in seeing follow-ups to any of those films that they've released. Not, they're not bad films, but I don't really need a Coco 2. And he goes back to the land of the dead, or Inside Out, we're back inside Riley's head and it's a different stage of her life. I don't need really to see that. I mean, Inside Out probably has more potential than most of these other ones for sequels, but I think most of them stand alone perfectly well. And to make a sequel or a prequel to them would only cheapen their brand. So I'm hoping that, I know we're getting Toy Story 4 next. And after that point, it sounds like they are planning on doing way more of a focus on originals. They have two films set for 2020 that are supposed to be original, and then another two original films that are in early development for, I guess, 21, 22, around there, 2021, 2022. So it's interesting to see what they're doing now. It does feel like they had a really strong run for the first decade or so, and then kind of a hit or miss right around the last 8 years. I'd say since Toy Story 3, it's been very up and down. And it does feel like they're starting to pivot back to quality that we expect from them. With Coco, with Incredibles 2, and then with Toy Story 4, which all those Toy Story movies are amazing, so I'm hoping that this will be up to the level. It's a new director coming into it, Josh Cooley here, as opposed to John Lasseter and Lee Unkrich, who did the third film. So it's now that speaking of John Lasseter, of course, was recently announced he would leave Pixar at the end of the year due to, I guess, harassment accusations and inappropriate touching and some of those kinds of things in the workplace. It's going to be interesting to see what Pixar does next, how they pivot from there. I think it does sound like Pete Docter is going to be moving up into a more pivotal role, and considering how great the films he's directed are, I think that is a good sign. So hopefully they will stick more to originals for the time being and only go for a sequel when it feels absolutely necessary. Again, I'd like to see Incredibles 3, but other than that, I don't want them to milk some of these the more recent quality films like Inside Out and Coco for a while, if at all. I think that original films have always been their strong suit. And, I'm really, really interested to see what they have coming up next. It looks like they have like a suburban fantasy film with a lot of, elves and trolls and that kind of things coming up. So that could be interesting to see exactly. They haven't really done that kind of thing just yet. And then they have, so they have some interesting stuff in the pipeline. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot of details about them right now. So I'm definitely, I'm a long time Pixar fan, and I'm here for pretty much anything that they do. But the fact that Coco and Incredibles 2 are both on the upper scale of their films to date is an encouraging sign. So I definitely want to see them continue that hot streak. Let's get back to building the reputation where Pixar is unparalleled levels of storytelling every single time, right out the box. Like they do not miss a beat. I think we can do that, and I think Pixar can do that. Not me, I can't do it. I would never presume to be like, I can handle this. Step aside, Pixar, I got this. I think Pete Docter's leadership, I think, is a wise move. He's definitely earned that promotion. If anybody in-house is going to get it, I'd like to see them work more with Brad Bird, more with Andrew Stanton, and I think there's a lot of potential for them to continue growing and stay on the path that they've been going down all this time. I think there's a chance they could become untouchable once again, especially now with I think Laika Studios is one of the other best animated studios out there right now. Walt Disney Animation Studios has really been stepping up their game lately with Moana and Zootopia, and we'll see how Ralph Breaks the Internet comes out. But there's a lot of competition in animation right now, and I would like to see Pixar continue to prove not only their dominance, but why their films are so great, and why they hold such a special place in people's hearts. So that's just what I want to talk about this episode with Incredibles 2. I wanted to kind of delve into my love of Pixar for a little bit, but that's all we have for now. If you like what we're doing over here on the Crooked Table Podcast, please consider contributing to our Patreon page at patreon.com/Crooked Table. You can also rate and review the show on iTunes to help others find us. And you can find me, Robert Yaniz Jr., on Twitter at Crooked Table. Of course, find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies at crookedtable.com. Next episode, probably going to be Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom related, so stay tuned for that. Until then, I've been Rob. We'll catch you around the table next week. Roll credits.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
The art of a little KED.